Hi everybody, and welcome to the video for section 14.3, the section on cause and effect. So this is the conclusion of section 14.3, and like section 14.2, this section is basically just a barrage of vocabulary. So chapter 14 doesn't have a ton of math per se inside of it. It mostly is just the language of statistics, the language of running surveys and clinical trials. So section 14.3 will be very similar to section 14.2, except we won't be talking about surveys so much in this section. We'll be talking about clinical trials, so trying to establish a cause and effect relationship between things. So here are several sort of opening statements to think about. Drinking coffee is good for you. Drinking even 1 cup per day can extend your lifespan by years. This is a claim that I recently saw in the news, so some study purports to have shown this. Fish oil is good for your heart. By taking a daily fish oil supplement, you can drastically reduce your risk of a heart attack. I have seen this claim made ad nauseum for the last decade or so. Okay, here's another claim. Aspartame, which is an artificial sweetener that can be found in things like diet soda. Aspartame causes cancer, so drinking regular soda rather than diet soda is actually better for you. Okay, so I'm on the record here as hoping this is false because I drink about 2 liters of Diet Dr. Pepper a day. So if this is true, I will be dead soon. And here's the last statement. You should stretch before exercising. Stretching greatly reduces the risk of injury during exercise. This statement here was preached as gospel when I was in high school. So before we would do anything in practice for football or whatever, we would have to stretch for about 20 minutes because our coach told us, right? If you don't stretch, you're increasing your likelihood of getting injured. So the reason I'm showing you all of these statements is that I hope you notice that each of these statements is a cause and effect statement. Drinking coffee causes something good for you. Taking fish oil supplements causes something good for you. Drinking aspartame causes something bad for you. Stretching causes something good for you. Okay, so each of these statements is expressing a cause and effect relationship. And that's what this section is about. How would you prove or give evidence of any of these 4 statements? You know, how would you establish evidence for a cause and effect relationship? That's what this section is about. So first, some vocabulary. A correlation between X and Y occurs when there is an observed relationship between X and Y. So just for example here, ice cream sales and murder rates are positively correlated. As ice cream sales increase, so does the number of murders. Okay, so if X here represents ice cream sales and Y here represents number of murders, there's an observed relationship between those two things. As one goes up, so does the other. As one falls, so does the other. That's what's called, that's an example of positive correlation. As one goes up, so does the other. Okay. Here's another example. An observational study concluded that hormone replacement therapy could reduce symptoms associated with menopause and reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. So basically, these authors, they studied 2 things. They studied the amount of hormone replacement therapy you get, that's sort of X, and Y here is the symptoms associated with menopause or your risk of coronary heart disease. So basically, in this case, there's a negative correlation because as the amount of HRT goes up, these bad things went down. Okay, so this first example here is a positive correlation. As X here, which was ice cream sales, goes up, so does murder rates. And in this case, you have a correlation that's negative. As HRT goes up, Y, which is measuring menopause symptoms and coronary heart disease risk, that goes down. Okay, so in both of these examples, you could ask the following question. Okay, I've seen a correlation. I've seen an observed relationship between 2 things. Is that relationship causal? In other words, is ice cream sales going up causing murder rates to go up? Or is murder rates going up causing ice cream sales to go up? You know, you could ask that question. Is there something causal here? And, you know, you can make, I suppose, an argument for one of those, like think about murder rates going up, causing ice cream sales to go up. Well, you could argue that as the amount of murdering goes up, the amount of depression goes up, and the amount of depression could, I suppose, cause more ice cream sales, right? People are sad about murdering, about their friends being murdered or something, and so more people eat ice cream. I don't know. You could make an argument like that, right? I don't think that you think that is reasonable, but you can make such an argument. And in this example right here, you could argue that, oh, this hormone replacement therapy seems to be causing this menopause reduction and this coronary heart disease reduction. But the question is, how would you prove something like that? And in particular, I think that this first example, I think that you all agree is BS. There's no causal relationship here. So what's actually causing the correlation here is not ice cream sales causing murder rates to go up or vice versa. The fact is that there is a lurking variable, and that lurking variable is temperature outside. So as the temperature rises, ice cream sales go up, right? Because when people are hotter, they want to eat more ice cream. And as the temperature goes up, so do murder rates. So murderers are people too, right? And murderers don't like being out in the cold. So as temperature goes up, they're more likely to venture out and murder, right? So there's no causal relationship linking these two things. There's actually another variable, which is just seasonal, right? The temperature outside that explains the correlation. And so in this example here, actually, hormone replacement therapy, it turns out, does not actually lower your risk of coronary heart disease, and it also does not reduce symptoms associated with menopause, even though it appears that it does. So what happens in this example here is that the women who were already using HRT tended to come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds than those who didn't. And people who come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds tend to do things like have better diets and exercise. And it turns out that it was this better diet and exercising that was the cause of these other things up here, the reduction in symptoms of menopause and the reduction in the risk of coronary heart disease. Okay. So anytime there's a correlation between two variables, before you start to conclude that there's a causal relationship there, you need to ask yourself, are there lurking variables, or in your book's terminology, your book calls it a confounding variable, but either one of those terms is standard. So you need to always ask yourself, is there something confounding this relationship? So something that's lurking in the background that's causing this correlation. So in this particular example here, this first example, if you conclude that ice cream sales cause murder rates, there's sort of no harm done, right? Who really cares if you make that mistaken conclusion? But in this example here, a lot of harm was done actually, because if you don't need HRT, you really shouldn't be taking it. But a lot of people saw this study and they thought, oh, to reduce my risk of heart disease and to lower my menopause symptoms, I should be doing this, right? Because there's a causal relationship here. And it turns out that those people caused themselves a lot of harm needlessly. Okay, so they took hormone replacement therapy when they didn't need it, and it caused them other complications. So this is not sort of just an idle issue that I'm bringing up here. The fact that correlation does not necessarily imply that there's a causal relationship. Okay, so you have to be careful. And here's, in my mind, the most salient example of this correlation versus causation issue. And this is an example from the 1920s or something, early 20th century. So first of all, SIDS stands for Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. So this is a disease whose cause is currently unknown. But basically what happens is, you as a parent will wake up in the morning and you'll go to your infant's crib and your infant will just be dead. And there will be no apparent cause of death. Okay, so it's certainly an extremely frightening thing, and one of the reasons that makes it frightening is because people don't know what causes this. If we knew what caused it, we would do something about it, right? But we don't really know what causes it. And so this disease has been known for more than a century, and of course, people, like as soon as this disease was discovered, people were interested in figuring out what causes it. And in the early 1900s, doctors thought they'd found the cause, an enlarged thymus gland. So what happened was, back in the day, Well, there wasn't a lot of like, what's the word? So doing medical trials was difficult back in the day because getting bodies to like perform autopsies on was difficult. Your sort of average run-of-the-mill person did not donate their body to science. That was seen as like a classless thing to do, right? It was classier to be buried. I mean, you want to let a doctor cut you up after you die like an animal? You know, who would do that? So doctors were limited in the kind of material they could gather. And so back in the day, in the 1900s, early 1900s, they basically could only get cadavers that were from poor people. So the family couldn't afford to bury this person, so the doctors would get their hands on cadavers that way, and that's how they would gather data for clinical trials. So anyway, keep that in mind. When it comes to SIDS, though, doctors finally were able to break out of the cycle of just sort of getting poor people's cadavers, because rich people were affected by SIDS also, right? This was a disease that cut across socioeconomic lines, and so rich people were super concerned in finding the cause of this because they didn't want their baby to die. So, you know, the rich and middle class were now willing to let doctors perform autopsies on their dead children who had suffered SIDS. So what the doctors did was they performed autopsies on dead babies and compared the size of their thymuses to the thymus size of previously autopsied babies. So they'd been running studies for a while now on like trying to measure the size of given organs. So they had in mind what was supposed to be a good size of a thymus. Okay, and so what the doctors did was they compared the size of the thymuses from the SIDS babies to the size of the thymuses from just babies that had died from other causes. And what they found was previously autopsied babies all had smaller thymuses. And so what that means is that the SIDS babies all had enlarged thymuses. Okay, so the thymuses of SIDS babies were all big. So here's what the doctors hypothesized. They thought, oh, what's causing SIDS is an enlarged thymus. This gland being too big makes it difficult for the babies to breathe. So the babies basically suffocate in their sleep. And so they were like, Eureka, we found the cause. The cause is an enlarged thymus. And they made this judgment based on a correlation between large thymuses and dying of SIDS. Or if you like, a correlation between small thymuses and not dying of SIDS. Okay, they found a correlation relationship and they then concluded that the relationship was causal. Okay, this was an extremely bad thing for them to do because the doctors who discovered this, their next move was to tell parents, oh, if you want your baby not to die of SIDS, you should make sure that their thymuses are small. Well, the question is, how do you make sure that a given organ is small? Well, if you ever want to shrink an organ to make it small, you bombard it with radiation. That's how you can ensure that an organ is small. So doctors took thousands of babies and bombarded their thymus glands with radiation to try to shrink their thymus glands. And as a result, in the 1920s, there were thousands of babies who died from throat cancer. Okay, because their throats were bombarded with radiation to try to prevent them from dying from SIDS. Okay, so again, the overall global picture of this example is doctors concluded from a correlation that there was actually a causal relationship between large thymuses and SIDS. That was a mistake, okay, and based on that mistake, thousands of babies died from throat cancer because these doctors bombarded their throats with radiation based on this mistaken causal assumption. It turns out that the lurking variable here was also socioeconomic class, just like the previous example. So basically, these previously autopsied babies, they were all from poor families because that's the only way the doctors could get bodies to autopsy. And it turns out that being poor has deleterious effects on the human body, especially in the early 1900s. So all of these babies actually had thymuses that were shrunken because they were malnourished. So the doctors thought, oh, these SIDS babies have enlarged thymuses. But that was incorrect. The SIDS babies all had normal thymuses. It's just the doctors had never autopsied a middle class or rich baby before. You know, they'd only had cadavers that were from poor families. So the lurking variable here was socioeconomic class. This baseline they had established from the previous babies, that baseline was off because their sample was skewed. Okay, so anyway, a correlation between X and Y does not mean that you can conclude that X causes Y or vice versa. In other words, correlation does not imply causation. If you've taken a stats course before, this phrase was pounded into your brain most likely. And again, this is not an idle issue. Okay, here's an example where doctors had correlation, they concluded causation, and they killed thousands of babies because of that. Okay, so you have to be careful. Just because you see a correlation does not mean that you can conclude there's a causation. You need more evidence than just a correlation if you want to imply that there's a causal relationship. Okay, so how do you establish that there's a causal relationship? A correlation won't do it for you. The best and probably the only way, I mean, you can, I hesitate to say this, but in general, what you should do is run a clinical trial. Okay, so inside of a clinical trial, you have control over the variables. So you can control for things like lurking variables. So to show that X causes Y, you need to isolate X from other possible causes, other possible confounding variables. And presumably, because you are running a trial, you have control over this. So you can make this choice. Okay, so what you do is you run a controlled study or a controlled trial, whichever word you want to use. The subjects are divided into groups. Some groups receive a treatment to establish the cause and effect relationship between a treatment and a cure. Other groups, control groups, don't get the treatment. And then you compare and contrast what happens between the two groups. So you don't just want to control things, you want things to be randomized because you want to take the human element out of the picture as much as possible, just like you did in section 14.2. So subjects are assigned to the treatment group or the control group, sorry, there should be or the control group randomly. So you let randomization decide who gets what. Okay, so suppose you are testing a drug. You've randomly assigned some people to a control group. What do those people do? Well, sometimes they do nothing, right? It depends on what you want them to do. But so sometimes when you're testing a drug, you just have a group of people that you are following, and you just see how they do. You don't do anything to them. But sometimes they receive a fake treatment. They receive a placebo, in other words. And sometimes you have multiple control groups where one group receives nothing, and they know they're receiving nothing, and another control group receives a placebo. They receive a fake treatment. And you track how both groups do, and you compare how both groups do to the treatment group, the group that actually receives a real treatment. Okay, so a placebo-controlled study is a study in which members of the control group take a placebo. So there is a control group that has a placebo. A blind study is a study in which participants don't know to which group they belong. So again, like imagine you are running a trial that's supposed to test whether or not a pain drug is effective. And imagine that you give a pill to a participant and you say, hey look, this pill I'm giving you, it's a placebo. It's a fake treatment. Okay, now tell me how it does with your pain, right? Your study probably won't get very many reliable results if you do things like that. So in a blind study, you make sure that the participants don't know if they're receiving a placebo or not. And in a double-blind study, you make sure that the researchers also don't know. So you can imagine that maybe the participants don't know, but the researchers do know. You can imagine the researchers giving sort of subtle hints with their facial expressions or with like the way they smile or something. Again, it's just best to take the human element out of these things. So if you have a study where neither the participants nor the researchers know who's getting what, you've sort of taken the human element out, and now hopefully the drug will just take its course, right? You can decide whether or not it's effective. Okay, so in general, if you want to test a drug, the gold standard is a randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blind study. So if you want to establish a cause and effect relationship between your drug and a cure, this is what you would need. You will need it to be randomized. You need it to be a placebo or a control group of some kind, and in general, you need it to be double-blind. Although in some cases, in some trials, that's not the case. So depending on the disease the drug is supposed to attack, the study might not be blind at all. So here's a table from the original paper on the measles vaccine. So notice that there's a control group, so there's an unvaccinated control group, and there's a live vaccine group. But in this case, the doctors kept track of who got what, and the patients, I believe, also knew who got what. Because the thing is, with measles, you sort of either have measles or you don't. You know, it sort of doesn't matter whether you know you have measles or not. You either have it or you don't. It's not something like pain where psychology plays a role. You see what I'm saying? With measles, you know, psychology doesn't really play a role in whether you have the virus in your system or not. So again, sometimes you have studies that are not blind, and it doesn't really matter. So think about vaccine trials. You should still have a control group, but in a vaccine trial, like of an AIDS vaccine or an Ebola vaccine, it doesn't really matter if the patients know which group they're in. You know, like you can't sort of fake getting over Ebola, right? You can't really fake getting rid of AIDS or whatever. Okay, so I want to wrap up this section by talking about some issues with clinical trials. So again, the global picture here is you want to establish a cause and effect relationship. What's the best way to do that? The best way to do that is with a clinical trial. Well, you can't always do that. And here's a question that I want you to consider. Do cigarettes cause lung cancer or not? Most of you know that the answer to this question is yes. Okay, and the answer is yes. There's really no doubt that the answer here is yes. However, a clinical trial, a randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trial, has never been run to test this question. Okay, why is that? Well, because a clinical trial that tests whether or not this question is whether or not the answer is yes or no, such a trial would look like this. You take a group of non-smokers. You randomly assign them into two groups. One group will smoke cigarettes, and the other group will smoke fake cigarettes, and the fake cigarettes should be good enough that you can't tell the difference. So there's a treatment group and a placebo group, in other words. And so in other words, what I'm saying is if you want to run a clinical trial here, you force some people to smoke, and then you force some people to fake smoke, and then you just see what happens to the groups over time. So 40 years later, you check in and see what the lung cancer rates are and compare. Okay, there's a reason that no trial like this has ever been run, and the reason is ethics, right? So sometimes there are certain clinical trials that you can't run simply because of ethical concerns. Right? It is not ethical to take non-smokers and ask them to smoke or to force them to smoke. So the reason that the answer to this question is yes is because researchers have done their best without clinical trials. Right? So there have been all sorts of observational studies done where researchers have controlled for all sorts of confounding variables, and the answers always come back yes. Right? No matter how you control, no matter what observational study you run, cigarettes cause lung cancer, okay, but no clinical trial has been run for ethical issues. Here are a couple of other questions you might consider. Does lowering the top marginal tax rate make the economy better? So in other words, is there a cause and effect relationship between lowering taxes and a healthy economy? And on the other hand, is there a cause and effect relationship between raising minimum wage and hurting the economy? Okay, so these are questions that economists argue about all the time, and politicians argue about all the time. And we certainly would like to have answers to these questions, wouldn't we? However, suppose that I said, okay, let's establish this cause and effect relationship. How would we do that? Well, it seems to me that if we really wanted to do this, we would I don't know, I guess we would take the world and randomly divide the world into two categories. In the first category, we would have countries that raise their top marginal tax rates, and we have other countries that either don't raise them or lower them or something, right? And then we just see how the countries do. So maybe the US raises its top marginal tax rates, but the UK doesn't. And maybe France raises its rates, but Canada doesn't. You know, so we force all these countries to do this and then just see what happens over time. And same thing with this other question, right? We could just force some countries to raise minimum wage and force other countries not to, and see what happens. Here, there isn't really an ethical concern so much as there is just a practical concern. I mean, you can't do this. There's no way to get countries on board to do this. So a lot of economics questions simply can't be answered using clinical trials because it's not practical to run them. There's no way you could actually run clinical trials to test a question like this. You know, you couldn't get 80 countries on board to go with this trial with you. Okay, so again, in sort of like an ideal world, we could run clinical trials for everything and measure cause and effect relationships that way because that's the gold standard. But in the real world, we have ethical concerns sometimes, and sometimes we simply cannot run a clinical trial to test certain questions. You know, so when we actually can't run a clinical trial, we have to settle for next best things, which is like lots and lots of observational studies, lots and lots of studies that try to control for different confounding variables, and so on. So anyway, globally, clinical trials that are randomized and placebo-controlled are the best, but we can't always achieve those. And that's the conclusion of section 14.3.